minutes at the end, we do something called 1-minute papers. And I have them write out what stood out to them in the class for that period, what questions they still have, what do they want to keep learning about in that. And that practice helps solidify the material in a person's mind for a lot longer so you can recall it. So just real quick, to do this sort of in a verbal exercise, just help me out. What's one or two things that stood out from our first section, our first time together? I know I'm new to you. You guys know one another, so there's a bit of an imbalance here. I'm trying to get to know you. You're trying to get to know me. But help me out. What's one or two things that jumped out? Let's have 3 or 4 people jump in and say, yes, please.
Philosophy is not necessarily about like proving you wrong, but more about like helping you find out what's right.
Yeah, I use the phrase, seek clarity over agreement. Right, that's a great way to put it. That's actually very, very helpful in life because people are so defensive today. And if you can diffuse that right away, look, I'm just trying to see clarity on what we're talking about here. That'll go a long way, and then you can get to the, trying to convince someone of your argument part. Yes, please. Give me your first names too, because I'm learning them along the way.
Colin.
Colin.
And the truth in today's society is so distorted, and I feel like philosophy can help.
Yeah.
That truth or truths of.
Yeah, that's good. We live in a time where truth is distorted, it's veiled. Sometimes philosophy, bad philosophy, can do that, distort the truth. But good philosophy hopefully will help us find the truth. 2 more. Yes, please.
I think it's interesting how much philosophy can be helpful in like the rest of your life, like if you're doing statistics and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Going back was like I was unexpected.
Yeah. You will find it permeates all fields. In fact, in most cases, if you get what's called a PhD in your field, that PhD, you know what it stands for? It's a philosophical doctorate. It means you're reaching the highest point of your field. It doesn't mean piled high and deep, like some people used to say, right? You're full of something. I won't be overly explicit. But no, it's a philosophical degree about a particular area, right? So if you have a PhD in psychology, you're thinking about the highest questions that a psychologist can ask in their field, okay? So that's what PhDs are for. So that's really helpful. I think that's a great comment. 1 or 2 more. Don't be shy. Yes.
It's not necessarily just like life without God is the conceivable, but also the concepts and like things that He made.
Mm.
So it's not a bad answer to say something other than God isn't conceivable.
I like that. I like how you phrased that. God, in His creation, has actually given us things to use in life that we can't do life without. I think philosophy or the life of the mind, using your mind correctly, is one of those things. So that's a really good way to put it. I hope I remember that. I'll have to write that down. Nice job. Just a few other, what I want to do is a few other practical comments about philosophy, just so you can get your mind around. It's like at a 10,000-foot level. We're flying over sort of understanding the field. And then the next few days we'll be, dropping in and be amidst the trees really wrestling with some of these things. So we're kind of still taking a 10,000-foot level right now. One of Socrates' disciples, and that's what you could call them, disciples, was Plato. And Plato is famous for a number of things, but one of the things he said is this, is that philosophy is a silent dialogue, at least in part, between the soul and itself. It's a silent dialogue between the soul and itself. If you get skilled at it, you learn how to talk to yourself better. Does anyone talk to themselves? Yeah. What do you say to yourself? That's a great question. You say that to yourself, or you're asking, or are you saying that what I'm asking is a good question? Yeah. But what do we say?
Constant inner monologue.
Yeah. Yeah, what kinds of things?
Sometimes I do math.
Okay. So we get, it's okay to laugh at it. I do, lots of people who are bent towards statistics and things like that will do math in their head on a regular basis. Why do you think you do math in your mind?
I like to solve problems, and so every now and then, like someone presents a math problem, or they say numbers, and then my brain starts to think about them and tries to process them. And
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good to know. It kind of is a pointer to what fields you might go into. That's good. What other things do you say to yourself? Yeah,
Sometimes it's like negative kind of self-talk.
can be. Yeah.
Like if you feel like you messed up, you can kind of overanalyze that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you might beat yourself up a little bit. Yeah, not so long ago, my son came home. Look, Dad, I bought you something, and it was a, I don't know if they have them out here, but Baskin Robbins peanut butter and chocolate ice cream. You know, and I had a long day, and it was a 14-hour day, and I got home. I started to get tired, and I'm watching a program on YouTube, and I'm like, oh, the ice cream. So I went and grabbed the ice cream, and before I knew it, that whole thing was gone. And I'm like, George, why did you eat all the ice cream? Couldn't you just take out a scoop and eat that? And there I was doing some of that self-talk, right? Why did you eat all the ice cream? Why did you eat the cake? You don't need all those calories, blah, 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 right? So we can talk to ourselves about a standard we have and when we meet it and when we don't. That's really important, right? People who don't do that arguably are less developed because they're not thinking about their values and their standards. One other, yeah, please, one or two, yeah.
I just like, my roommates are never sure if I'm talking to them or myself because I'm just at the
You're talking out loud.
Yeah, I know I got loud. I'm just really like, should I do that? Like, no, like, I don't need to do that. Or I can do this. Or why can't I find this? And just like stuff like that.
We learned when the lockdowns happened, my two adult sons were still living with us, and so all of us had to have working stations together. And we quickly learned who's a verbal processor out loud and who is not. I'm very internal. Like I can go through the workday just thinking through stuff in my mind, doing what I need to do on the computer and stuff. But my wife is like that. She's talking out loud about herself. Where'd I put the chapstick? What about this? Blah, blah, blah. What about this client? And I'm like, are you talking to me? And she's like, no. I'm just talking out loud. Oh, it took me a while to get used to it, right? There was one other over here, missed, and then here.
Just like planning a day out in my head, like how I'm gonna structure my effect, like
Planning.
do like a to-do list.
Yeah, and that could be a very good discipline that one has. How I'm going to structure my day. A lot of people will write it out on a list. Maybe you have a calendar or that. So yeah, it comes from inner dialogue. What else?
sometimes I have like existential like things that
Okay.
happen.
Plato would be happy about that.
Sometimes I'm like, am I really saved? Is God really
Oh,
real?
oops. Yeah.
Like, why am I here right now? Like, is this actually happening? Am I really sitting in this room? Sometimes my brain thinks that.
Yeah.
Randomly.
Is it your brain or your mind?
My mind.
Yeah, no.
Like, sometimes I just like randomly, like, those questions just like pop up.
Yeah. Do you think it happens to others?
Probably.
Yeah, it really seems to be the case. In fact, philosophy is about trying to hit upon what are those common existential questions that we all ask. They could be theological too. Am I actually saved? What does it mean to be in God seems distant. How about this verse? Bless you. Psalm 42. Why, my soul, are you downcast? He's talking to himself. Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. He's telling his soul what to do. Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. That's a really, really interesting psalm because it teaches us that the psalmist thought it okay to raise a question about God's hiddenness, his distance. Bless you. Something got to you, huh? That's okay. We all struggle actually with I mean, I think if you're honest, you struggle with God's distance at some point. Where are you in my life? Other times God seems so present that he's like the air we breathe, right? Sometimes we have to instruct our soul. Hey, don't be so downcast. It's okay to talk that way and to even not have a desire. But what's really interesting, the human mind, the human soul, can have a desire to have a desire. Animals don't necessarily do this. It's a really interesting distinction between animals and human beings. Animals seem to have desires. I want food, right? I need to go out to the restroom, whatever. But they don't have desires about desires. As a pastor, I used to have some people come and say, you know, George, I don't have a desire to study the Bible. Okay, that's fair. I appreciate your honesty. But do you want to study the Bible? Do you think you should want to study the Bible? Because it's a repository of truth and wisdom. He said, yeah, I do that. Okay, well, so you have a desire to have that desire. Well, that's a great place to start, to begin to pray to God that can you help cultivate in me or implant in me the desire to study your word more. We can have these different, philosophers call them first and second order desires. So you can actually have a desire to have a desire. It's really, really interesting. Psychologists will pick up on this and they'll try to find ways to help people with that. The beautiful thing about being a Christian is that you're not alone in doing it. The Buddhist actually has a struggle with this because the power has to come from within themselves. The Christian has the power of the Holy Spirit, God himself, to help to partner with those things. And this is one of the areas that Christianity is distinctive from other religions. Other religions can tell you what to do. Buddhism actually has some interesting practices that are helpful. But it doesn't give you any power, per se, to do it. Jesus said, I send a helper, an advocate to you, the Holy Spirit, to help you do these things, to have the desire, right? Philosophy can be an aid in this. And I actually think that David, you look at Solomon, and they're doing philosophy without calling it philosophy proper like we see in the Greek tradition. Plato's students, so Socrates, Plato, then Aristotle, I sometimes wonder if we call it Chipotle, should we call it Aristotle? I don't know. But Aristotle said this. He said, all men or all people desire to know. It's an interesting desire. If you're in education, one of the reasons you're here is you have a desire to know. Notice he doesn't say a desire to just believe, but he says to know. And there's a distinction that we can get at later on between knowing and just believing. That's really, really helpful. In fact, I would argue that the Bible talks more about knowledge than it does belief. So this is part of the human condition. We all have a desire to know. Sometimes philosophy is seen because people have experienced it maybe in a college class or maybe in high school. There's two extremes, at least, that I try to avoid when dealing with philosophy. I like this quote because it sort of encapsulates it. One author put it this way. He said, the word philosophy just spells boredom for some people. Those are the emotions that we have. If not just grief, why do I have to learn this? In fact, in my data and ethics class, I actually had a student, or I've had a few students, tell me that I have to take this class, but it's going to be a complete waste of my time. I'm like, I appreciate your honesty. Or sometimes they'll say that in the comments at the end. I thought this was going to be a complete waste of my time. But at the end of it, I'm not saying just because of me, I'm saying I think because the material is so important, they say, this was my favorite class this semester. Because I think it helps them so much. Sometimes people think that philosophy is, to a student's mind, what spinach is to a child's taste buds, a punishment to be endured and of questionable value, right? Was there a vegetable you didn't like as a kid, but your mom or dad made you eat it, perhaps? Does anyone know who Popeye is still? Right, yeah, you guys remember? Okay, I'm impressed, right. What does Popeye do? If he eats the spinach, he becomes stronger, right? The other extreme in philosophy and using it is when it becomes to the philosopher what spinach is to Popeye, the sole and sufficient means to cerebral muscle flexing, right? He continues, here philosophy sets itself up as the supreme authority on reality, and capable of decimating any enemy and hence of ultimate value. So it turns philosophy from a tool into something of ultimate value. When you learn logic, argumentation, and you can ask the right questions, you do have the power to tear down another person's worldview and what they think. And you can really put them in an existential crisis. I'm arguing, at least from the Christian perspective, that's not the goal of philosophy, to show that their argument is just bad, and I mean, we should show when arguments fail, but it's not meant to beat up people, right? It's supposed to be a tool that God gave us to help people. Now, the word itself is very interesting. The word itself comes from a couple of Greek words combined, and it means the love of wisdom. Now, if I were to ask you again to define or give me an understanding of what wisdom is, what would you say? If we were trying to help one another out. Yeah. Yeah, can you tell me more about why you use the term properly apply? For those terms?
Way, or effective way, or
Yeah.
a proper way, but like if you misapply knowledge or use it against someone to like their demise, then that's not wisdom. That's just like I feel like what Proverbs describes as a fool.
Yeah. Would everyone agree with that, or any addition? Looks like you're convinced. Yeah, that I think you hit it pretty spot on there. I like the observation that you said you can have knowledge. I mean, think of what kinds of knowledge and facts are available to us today. I mean, we live in a world, it's an unprecedented time in the world where you have access to so much knowledge, so many facts. Yet, there's a lot of scholarship that tends to show that people are using the tools to get the knowledge more for social media than they are to seeking truth. And so they lack wisdom. There's a lot of knowledge today, but arguably we lack wisdom. And I like how you put it, to properly do it. The scripture, when talking about it, also gives it a moral aspect to it. Right? So wisdom, in effect, if you look at the word in, and I'll talk more about this on Saturday. I'm going to do a talk called God is Wisdom. But wisdom is skill. The Hebrew word that we use here is chokmah in the Old Testament. And chokmah has a sense of being able to judge with skill. Being able to judge with skill. And in particular, it has the connotation of skill to live life. So if you were a wise sculptor, you would have a discerning ability, able to judge what material is best to do this particular kind of art or sculpture. If you were in medicine, you might have knowledge of different kinds of medicines, but what applies properly to this situation? morally. If you have skill, you know how to apply a moral principle in a particular context. And that actually is difficult to do. It takes some work, some effort. You'll see that when we get to, let's say, the abortion issue or animal ethics, for instance. Right? So it's a developed skill to live life in many different areas. In the Old Testament, particularly to live life in a morally or a godly way. Does that make sense to you? Now, I tell my administrators at the school, if it would be better to give a description about philosophy class that went like this, like, do you want skill in your life, in your relationships, in your moral life? Then come take Philosophy 101. But instead we give more of a dry description of what philosophy is. But if it is skill to live life, that's what it used to be, that's more attractive, I think, than other means. So the term philosophy itself means skill to live life, the love of wisdom. And philosophy can also refer to a whole world and life view, your approach to life. So someone might say, well, my philosophy of life is X or Y. I have a particular philosophy of drumming. I actually do. I used to teach drums. And there's a certain way to hold your sticks, to do blast beats on the drums, all sorts of things, right? And then that could apply, but I need more to that to live life well or skillfully. Playing drums is great, but I need a philosophy, a whole approach to life. And philosophy, that term itself can mean something like that as well. Now, something I encountered actually in church while I was going through graduate school, the church would use, or some of the pastors would use this verse. Some of you will be familiar with it. Colossians 2:8. Would you do me a favor and just read that for us? From there? Yeah, just get a different voice in the air here. You can say no. Or you can, like, I don't want to do that.
See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world, rather than on Christ.
Thank you. Now, read that way, is philosophy good or bad? Bad, right? But is that what the verse says? That's how it was preached to me. But the verse actually says this. Could you read that, Maria, for us, please?
See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world, rather than on Christ.
It's an important qualifier, right? See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, right? If someone said, don't eat food, well, you'd think that they're crazy. But if someone said to you, well, don't eat bad food, well, you're like, well, yeah, of course. You go to a restaurant, you get sick. Oh, man, they made bad food. Well, don't eat there again. The idea is to eat good food, right? Tastes good, you enjoy, it's healthy for your body. So the whole idea is that even Paul himself says philosophy has a good application. The famous author C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, good philosophy must exist, if for nothing else, in order to combat bad philosophy. And I think this is very, very true. We have to learn philosophy just simply, if this was it, just to combat bad philosophy. For instance, I'll give you an example. I'll ask a class. You don't have to put up your hand or anything. How many of you think that people are basically good? 90% of hands go up. Now, do you think that people are basically good? Yeah, especially if you're a Christian, from the Christian worldview, people are valuable, but they're not basically good because they're fallen, they're sinful, right? So people will say, well, people are basically good. I even get a lot of Christians who say that. And I say, okay, if they're basically good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And they'll say, well, it's because of institutions. But what's the problem with that answer?
Who runs the institutions?
Right, who runs the institutions? It's other people. Well, they say, well, the institution made them bad.
But who made the institution?
That's a great question, right? And so that philosophy, people are basically good, permeates our culture. You see it in especially the justice system right now. I can give you articles that one of the reasons that we in California, where I come from, bail is being removed is because they think the system is corrupt, and sometimes it is, but that people are being, whether it's arrested or brought up on charges on false premises. Does that happen? Of course, and we should try to eradicate it. But the philosophy behind it, and you can read it, is that, well, people are basically good, so we should default to their goodness. Now, I agree that we should say people are innocent until proven guilty. That's a posture of the justice system. But that doesn't mean that people are basically good. And when you make policies off of that, well, there's certain kinds of consequences, right? So that's a philosophy that is predominant today. A lot of parents think that their kids are basically good, and that informs their parenting, right? You can agree or disagree, but that has to be dealt with on a philosophical level and a theological level. Is that making sense to you at all? Okay. It's something to be aware of. I love to ask people in conversations, well, do you think people are basically good? And then why do you think there's so much evil and suffering in the world? Usually a response back will be, well, you think people are basically evil. And I said, oh, no. That's not my belief. I think people are basically bad and have to grow into goodness. Now, how they do that is a hugely important question. But I don't think that they're basically evil. I think, there's various degrees depending on your environment, your parenting, your country. It could be a whole host of things that affects you, right? We take that into consideration. So good philosophy must exist in order to combat bad philosophy. You could also say it otherwise. Good theology must exist in order to combat bad theology, right? So it goes into other fields as well. So let me give you a working definition of philosophy. This comes from a gentleman named Ed Miller. It's from one of the textbooks I used to use. And he put it this way, and I think it's a good way to put it. Philosophy is the attempt to think rationally and critically about the most important questions. Philosophy is the attempt to become skillful at, to think rationally and critically about the most important questions. And so I like to ask people, what do you think, and we've already talked a little bit about it here, what do you think are some of the most important questions in life are? It's great to ask friends that, family. Thanksgiving dinner really gets fun when you ask that. It's interesting, people's responses. Sometimes they haven't thought very deeply about it. I hear that. Life is busy, you're just trying to survive, you don't ask those types of questions. But it is important to clarify some of our deepest values. And if we don't think about them, we're likely to take in certain values that are not good for us. Right. So how do we think rationally and critically about the most important questions? Just real quick, if I was going to write them on the board, put them out there, what would be a handful of the most important questions someone could ask?
What is truth?
Yeah, certainly Pilate asked that of Jesus in a more tongue-in-cheek way, but in a much more deeper way. What is truth? What do we mean when we use the word truth? It's like love. We use it all the time, but it's not so easy to define. Yeah?
What happens after you die?
Yeah, boy, we don't always think of that as much. Maybe you do. I don't know. I actually thought this troubled me when I was young. I remember going to my grandfather's grave, who had passed away when I was 4, and I looked at the headstone, and you know how it reads, 1935 to 1975 or whatever, right? I looked at it and I asked the group, mainly my grandmother there, and I said, is that Grandpa's telephone number to heaven? And they sort of, they chuckled a little bit. I wanted to know what happened to Grandpa. I know his body is there, but is his life sustained in any important way? I was 4 years old and I was already asking that question. I think kids do this naturally, as long as they're given space to do it. I hear it come out in song. I can give you song after song of a parent writing about the questions their child brought up when they were really young. Important question. What happens when you die? Does anything survive? And if so, what is it? And how do we make sense of that? 2 more. It would be odd if we couldn't come up with 2 more.
Does God exist?
Yeah, can you tell me why that's one of the most important questions? Or-
Because your life kind of depends on that. If there is a higher being
Mhm.
who makes the rules of like afterlife and all this kind of stuff, it's kind of important to know if that's a thing or not.
Yeah, is there a ultimate creator that we can rely on and that holds both justice and love, in a skillful way? Right? Yeah. You think you had one? Yeah, certainly the God question is going to affect that. The question about life after death is going to affect it tremendously. Right? You read Shakespeare, you get the phrase, you even see it, he knew the Bible well, right? Eat and drink, for tomorrow you die. That could be a philosophy of life. Look, I may not be a materialist trying to collect things, but I'm an experientialist. I want to get all the experiences I can before I die. That's a lot of people's philosophy of life today. They acquire experiences. Maybe not so much material things. There's been a reaction to that, though that still exists. But yeah, that's a hugely important question. And how do you find out your ultimate purpose in life, right? You can find a lot of mini purposes, right? Finishing the class, finishing the semester. What's my purpose this summer? But what is the overarching purpose of life? It's a deeply important question that can sustain you through very, very difficult times. If you guys haven't read it yet, read something like Viktor Frankl's book on meaning in life. He was in a concentration camp in Germany during the Second World War, and he said people can live without food for a time, they can live without sex, they can live without all these sorts of things, right? But they can't live without meaning and purpose. They can't live without meaning and purpose. If you take that away, life is inconceivable without it. And his book is very, very powerful on that subject, coming from a person who experienced some of the worst things there is to experience on the planet. Okay, I want to suggest to you to sort of use this framework. I'm going to finish off our time here for this session. I want you to think of philosophy. It comes to us kind of on 3 different levels or 3 different ways. You almost could, sometimes I like to use an analogy of a house. If someone is coming to my door to sell me something, it doesn't happen as much today because most marketing is done online and that, but someone might come to your door to sell you solar panels or something, right? And they knock on your door and you open it up and they would say, do you have solar panels? And you might say, no, I don't have those. Maybe it's too expensive for you. And they say, do you believe in helping the planet, reducing your electricity? You're like, yeah, that sounds like good stuff. And they say, look, the state now is subsidizing free solar panels for homes. And your ears might perk up, right? So the salesman is there, or salesperson, to show you that you need something, and here is something that will satisfy that need, and here is a reasonable way to accomplish it, right? They're in the front, they're dialoguing with you, they're trying to give you reasons, at least a good salesperson would. Does that make sense? But someone else, at least it used to be this way, it's not much anymore. If you had a friend or family member, some people might have a key to the house, or you give them a key to your back gate. Like I have neighbors and friends, they have a key to my back gate, so like if I'm traveling, they used to take care of my dog, or they would take care of my house, or things like that. Friends would, sometimes they come in through the front door, but sometimes they come through the back door, right? Because we trust them without thinking about it too much. And that's just natural part of life. Philosophy is kind of like that. Sometimes it can come directly to us. We take a class in college. But other times it kind of comes to us through the back door, and we're not even realizing it. We've let it in, and we really haven't examined it. Let me give you some examples, okay? Level 1 philosophy is kind of like what we're doing here. We're dealing with reason and logic, and it really covers 4 basic areas of life. And these, for some of you who took a class in philosophy, this will be a reminder. For others, these are new terms that you really should get to know, because it will help you evaluate other fields of knowledge, okay? And I'm going to try to establish that for you. Take something like this, metaphysics. Everyone knows what physics is, the study of physical reality. But metaphysics means above. Meta means above. It doesn't just mean Facebook owner. It means what ultimately exists, even beyond the physical world, right? Now that could include something like God, right? And if I was to ask you, let's say I put this box up here, and I say, well, what actually exists? And if it exists, I'll put it in that box. So, Ezra, right? We go to what you said earlier. Numbers. Do numbers exist? Do they get to go in the box?
I mean, from my brain, I would say yes, because I haven't studied enough about it. That's just my automatic thinking of what
Yeah.
I'm taught, so yes, but
Yeah.
I think if I were to do more research and stuff, my answer would change, but for now, yeah, it's yes.
Right. The number 1 and all the following numbers get to go in the box, right? And then I asked, but what kind of, and this is called, in metaphysics, it's called the study of ontology. It comes from a Greek word ontos, which means something's being, its nature. What is it in and of itself? So when I say numbers exist, they get to go in the box, but what are they? Right? I can't put the number 1 on a scale and say, oh yeah, it weighs 4 pounds. That doesn't work. So it's not like bananas. So then what, if it exists, what kind of existence does it have? Thought. Actually, language might be based on that. Or language is based at least on logic, which numbers are also based on. But you're getting at the right thing, because I could put language up there. And let's say you say, well, something like English, or pick a different language. English exists. So a language exists. There seems to be no doubt in our minds that we're speaking to one another in English right now. But what kind of thing is English? Again, I can't put it on the scale and weigh it. I can't find its atomic number. Yeah, thought.
Would it be like a symbol or like a representative of an idea?
Yeah. So you can have, yeah, well, to me, what does that signify? What is water? It's not a trick question. I'm not trying to be funny, but stick with me here.
Hydrogen dioxide.
Right. So it has a certain component there that the chemist could describe to us. So H2O exists. This is a physical thing, right? Whether I'm on Earth or Mars or maybe another exoplanet, if we say water, we mean H2O. And that exists as a combination of these atoms. You with me? We need to get Jeff Zwerig and he can talk to us about all the other aspects. But we can also, in a different language, use a different word. Like what?
Agua.
Right? So we say agua. These two things aren't the same, right? Well, at least they're different letters, right? Philosophers call these tokens. Tokens are references, language, that refer to something that exists. So we can use different tokens to refer to something that exists. So we can put H2O over here, but we can use different kinds of tokens, different kinds of language to do that. But I think something that you're after is language are ways, are containers, tokens for meanings. What do we mean by water? We mean H2O. What do we mean by love? I think there's no doubt we would put love in the box. But what is it? Right? That's a description or a definition of it, right? But what kind of thing is love? It's not a substance like water. It doesn't have physical properties, so it has to be something else. If you reduce it to neurological stuff, notice you wouldn't be able to have that absent from the body. So how does God love? Right? So it must be something that's immaterial. Yes, comment. Or questions.
Something that I feel like, I don't remember where I heard this, but just like the most tangible things as a Christian are the spiritual things, and like the most real things don't exist here. So like God's kingdom is the most real kingdom, and we can't see it, or like
Right. So it must be something that either has a different, like Hugh talks about this, Hugh Ross, has a different either physical dimension or it has a mental immaterial dimension to it, or spiritual if you want to choose to use that word, right? So numbers, interestingly, if they exist, they seem to be immaterial. Something our mind can capture a hold of and is very useful for dealing with the physical world. That's really interesting. Why would abstract numbers be able to tell us so much about the physical world? That's actually a huge problem, especially for what's called secularists or naturalists. The Christian has an explanation for that. We might get to that later. Language has a set of meanings for its words. Meanings seem to be a lot like numbers. They exist, our minds can grasp them, but they don't seem to have a physical existence. You're referring to spiritual things, God's kingdom. Okay, this is helpful in biblical interpretation. So if you see Christ talking about his kingdom, what does he mean metaphysically? Most readers, I would say most, maybe I'm mistaken, if they don't understand this category, they don't know how to interpret what Jesus is talking about when it comes to God's kingdom. Because what do we mean by it ontologically? God's kingdom turns out to be something like where God's will is done. Wherever God's will is done, on earth as it is in heaven, that is where God's kingdom is. So God's kingdom is an extension or an application of God's moral and perfect will. Right? That's why we pray the Lord's Prayer in that sort of manner, actually. Who was doing the devotion today before the meal? Nate? Is that Nate? Right? Nate said he read from Galatians, and he used the word flesh. Now don't check out on me here. What does flesh mean? Right? Ontologically, metaphysically, what are we talking about? What are we referring to? Now, the word in Greek can mean carne. It can mean actual flesh, flesh on bone. But that's not what he was referring to. That's not what Paul's referring to.
It's like in the same sense of carnal.
So notice you said carnal desire, right? So is it referring to desires? And if so, what kinds of desires? Yeah, you could say immoral desires, and what those may turn out to be are disordered desires. This is very important for spiritual formation, for moral formation, and also for understanding psychology. Because God may have given us good desires, right? To have friendships, to appropriately eat, those are good desires. But when they become disordered, you take those desires and try to fulfill them wrongly. A little kid outside playing in the mud makes mud pies, and then he tries to eat them when he's hungry. The desire for food is good, but it's disordered when they're eating mud pies. Right? Same thing, arguably, about the flesh. What Paul is saying is the flesh is a reference to disordered dispositions, both in the body and the soul. Does that make sense to you? And when you think about it that way, God has made the body good, but its impetuses can become disordered. They can desire the wrong things, right? Your body is kind of like a power pack for the soul. It's how your soul gets expressed in the physical world. And so those desires of whether you call it your heart or your mind, when they get settled in our body, are they settled on the right things or the wrong things? Right? When you get cut off on the road, what do you automatically do? Be honest.
Learn how to drive.
You might yell out at the person, right? You might give them particular hand signals, right? Do you pray? You know, Rebecca has signs in her car that say, "Bless you, brother, sister," right? That you hand out to them. You can actually train yourself to respond rightly when you're cut off on the road, right? Or it can ruin your day, right? The flesh refers to both soulful and bodily dispositions that we have. And Paul wants us to order those rightly. That is a metaphysical thing. It's very, very interesting. And so you can actually study and try to understand more deeply what is Paul's metaphysics. A lot of Bible teachers and others don't understand these categories, and so they don't go that deep. And one of the things that I did in seminary was train pastors to think this way, to help understand. Now, I'm not saying go preach a sermon and start off with, well, Paul's metaphysic is such and such. No, that's that's not going to work with people. We can do it a little bit in the class setting, but in order for you to think deeply, these philosophical categories are going to be very, very important. You know, what else do we get to put in to the box? Right? God, souls, yeah. Time is another interesting one. I mean, we all think time exists, but it's interesting that a lot of physicists today think time is an illusion. And you would say, well, that's crazy. Well, given some of the physical theories, they actually think time is an illusion. I don't think time is an illusion, right? And there's different theories. There's a difference between what's called the A theory of time and the B theory of time. So people have tried to think about this, right? That's a good one. Just to finish off, epistemology is another field. You should get to know that word because it means your theory of knowledge, or how do you come to know things? So it's one thing to say what exists. It's another thing to how do we come to know they exist. That's your epistemology. That's very different. Is the surf high today? Some of you are yes, and that's what you're thinking about right now. And I totally understand. Notice, how do you know that? Well, you might read it on an app. How does the app know it? Yeah, how does it know it? But how does the app know the weather? The what? So there's sensors in the water that feed information that updates the app. Can the app be wrong? Yeah, if it's fed the wrong information. So it might tell you it's raining outside or the surf is high, but it could be mistaken, right? So your epistemology also has to do with your strength or your level of certainty that the proposition you're entertaining is true or false, right? How you know the surf is high is different than how you know the number one, or meanings in language, or your mind, you're introspecting your own thoughts. You don't have to go outside and measure those things. You can actually just deal with them in your mind. In fact, you were just talking about that you start thinking about these problems and trying to solve them. Sometimes you don't have to go very far to figure those out. No, you can just do them in your mind. Math, if it exists, is something you can do in the mind. But I can't do that with the surf. I have to get out there and see it. Whether there's a trillion galaxies out there, well, we have to observe those things. That has to do with your epistemology. So what you should think about is some people have an epistemology that says only things that you can know through the five senses is true. That's called empiricism. You don't have to know the word, but that's the idea. Very prevalent today. Others, I think the Christians fall into this category, they think that, yes, you can know things through your five senses. God has given us that. But there's other ways of knowing as well. There's mathematical knowledge. There's moral knowledge. And we come to know moral principles different than how we come to know the surf is high. Does that make sense to you? Right? That is not widely understood today. In fact, there's a number of not only philosophers, but scientists who actually think today that there is no such thing as morality. I can show you their books, their articles, and how it actually affects what college teachers teach their students. The last two, and we'll take a break, is what's called value theory and then logic. Those are the broad categories. Value theory has to do with what's of worth and importance. What do we most value? What do we hold dear to our hearts, and why? This has to do with ethics, how we treat people, animals, the environment. It can also deal with what's called aesthetics, beauty and art. Many people come to Kauai and say, it's beautiful. And they don't mean that subjectively, like it's just beautiful for them. because they post it on their Instagram. They go back and tell other people about the Grand Canyon of Hawaii. They think it's objectively beautiful. It's real and beautiful. Politics actually falls within value theory. I'm not talking just about partisan politics, Republican, Democrat, Independent, but I'm talking about how we set up relationships in a society. That falls under what's called value theory. So you can take political philosophy, and it will address that. You can take what's called normative ethics, and it'll address those things as well. Logic is simply the science and art of right reasoning. And there's actually very, very important ways on how to go about that. I won't get into it right now, but it's a tool that we use in these other fields. So I hope you just get a sense. This is a big universe to explore. There's so many questions and so many things. It's overwhelming. It's like walking into a library. I don't know if you get this experience. When I walk into big libraries, I get overwhelmed at all the knowledge that's there, or all the literature, the stories, right? There's no way I can take it all in. This is too with the fields of philosophy. There's so much there, but we have to pick and choose and focus in on a few things, okay? Now I know this might feel maybe a little bit dry. I hope I make it a little bit interesting to you. But this lays a foundation for us on what we're going to do in the next number of sessions together that I think you'll engage with and have a lot of fun with, okay? So let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll let you out at 12 to go enjoy lunch in the afternoon and sort of let philosophy go by the wayside for a little while. All right? Yeah. So we'll come back at 25 after.